Charles is a visiting professor in the Conflict Resolution Program at Georgetown University and a senior research fellow at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, South Africa. Prior to that, he served as the National Research Director in South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and as a professor of religion and society at the University of Cape Town. Charles is one of the authors of the Kairos South Africa document. He works largely in the area of transitional justice and social transformation in South Africa and on the African continent. He has worked on transitional mechanisms and peace-building initiatives in Rwanda, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, as well as being a consultant on political conflict in the Spanish Basque country Sri Lanka, Peru, and Colombia. We are honored with your presence this afternoon. This afternoon, Charles will speak on the Kairos document and the role of church resistance in apartheid South Africa. Charles?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. David Good. There you go. I'll say it again. David Good, thank you very much. And to you, Steve, and Carleen, and Rebecca, and all of your associates and staff, it's indeed a privilege and honor to be part of this project. I can honestly say that if I have a commitment to see rebirth and regeneration in South Africa, the other place I have that commitment to is Palestine. What is happening in Palestine has reached deep, deep, deep into the hearts of those of us who fought against apartheid. You know, I used to have a professor when I was doing my PhD. He said, you know, there are 3 places on God's earth where there is no human solution. Always wondered, if the thing doesn't have a human solution, what sort of solution does it have? Because my theology tells me that God works through human beings. But nevertheless, he said there are 3 places. The one is Northern Ireland, the other one is South Africa, and the third is Palestine. Well, 2 are down. There's 1 to go. What can I tell you about the church in South Africa? I can tell you it ain't what it used to be. Because that which drove us and that which produced the Kairos document in 1985 is not the church that we have today. It really isn't. We've lost our way. And so it's a privilege to be able to talk to you about that earlier church that existed in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, from my perspective, the problem with contemporary Christianity is that it has allowed itself to become part of the West's doctrine of national security. That's who we are. What is good for national security is the essence of Christianity. I can tell you that story at length, which I'm not going to bore you with. How whites came to South Africa. And thank God that they were placed on that southern tip of a continent, there to bring light to a dark continent, there to oppose apartheid, to oppose communism, and to say that we had to have apartheid as a bulwark against communism. I can tell you a similar story of Zionism and how it began. This was God leading God's people into God's land. You can tell me the story of American civil religion, and how the Pilgrim Fathers, and I think there were some others there too, came to this continent and believed they were inspired by God and they were led here. In God we trust. Manifest destiny. Thank God for America. Well, yes, thank God for many aspects of America, but not that notion that suggests that God and American foreign policy is one and the same thing. You know, it's this application of Christianity, this assumption that God is on our side. It's that assumption that makes it so very difficult for us to read the Bible, because we have preconceptions as to what the Word of God is all about. And then we look at the text and we read those preconceptions into the text. I think it was George Orwell who once said, one of the most difficult things in the world is to see that which is in front of our noses. We've got to stand back and we've got to learn to look at that which is in front of our noses through the eyes of others. The problem with Christianity, it is that over 2,000 years it has been appropriated into a Western ideology that manifests itself in South Africa, in Palestine, and in the United States. And forgive me for saying this, and I must look around before I say it, but you know, when I first came to this country, very early 70s, I couldn't believe that there was an American flag inside the church, next to the Methodist Church's flag, with the pulpit in the middle and the crucifix above. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. Church and state separate one from the other. It's not with the Christianity that I've encountered in your country or in mine. Christianity has been occupied by, it has been saturated with a Western notion of national security. That which serves us is that which comes straight from God. That's the heresy. That's the heresy, ladies and gentlemen, with which we live today. I want at the same time to remind you of, he was a German theologian, Johann Baptista Metz, what a fine name, who said that embedded in the scripture and in the Christian memory, there is the dangerous memory of the gospel. Embedded in it all, there's the dangerous memory of the gospel. So take off your spectacles, open your eyes, open your ears, he said, read carefully, slowly, deeply, and between the lines, and you will hear a message which will pass you by if you don't listen carefully. And it's that message that inspired liberation theologians throughout recent days. It is that message which has inspired feminist theologians and womanist theologians. It is extremely difficult to get out of our skin. But if we can do that, and we can put another set of spectacles on our nose, we will see something in that scripture, which is a little subversive. It's not comforting. It shakes us out of our complacency. That is the dangerous memory of the gospel. It's this alternative interpretation of the scriptures, it's this alternative understanding of the gospel that inspired some of us in 1985 to publish the South African Kairos document. We were in the midst of a war. If you asked any of us, myself included, where's this country of yours going? We would have said, we're heading for a bloodbath. We're heading for a bloodbath. That was our prediction. And we felt that in the name of the gospel, some of us needed to say something. And that was the birth of the Kairos document. And in the Kairos document, we said there are three kinds of theology. There is a state theology, there's a church theology, and there's a Kairos theology. Well, the state theology was very, very easy to discern. It was a message of law and order. God has placed us here for a purpose. We're going to resist all these troublemakers. We're going to resist communism. And we had thrown at us again and again and again Romans 13, where Paul allegedly said, you must obey your masters. He also told women to obey their husbands, by the way. He also told slaves to obey their masters. But obey the rulers. Obey Caesar. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God what is God's. What does all this mean? We tried to explain that dear old Paul was quite a conservative guy. He was quite worried about some of the radicals that he had to deal with. And he was telling them just to calm down. There are certain things you've got to give to God. But he also said, there are certain things you've got to give to the state. But he also said, there are certain things you give to God and to God alone. So we said there's a state theology and we have it shoved down our throats on a regular basis. We can sing the song as well as anybody else, but you know that theology. The more difficult one was the church theology. Church theology. Nice Christian people like you and me were expounding a certain theology. And at the heart of that theology was two things. One was reconciliation. You all need to love one another. Because that, according to the scriptures, according to them, according to those who were very nervous, was what the gospel was all about. That you've got to love one another. You've got to embrace one another. You know, love your enemies, all that sort of stuff. The second thing was that these people were opposed to violence. And so they said, we've got to have a non-violent approach. Well, we had to say that there are some people in South Africa who over 300 years of history tried to respond to the colonialists and then to the apartheid ideologists in non-violent ways. People who took their cap in their hands and asked the regime of the time to sit down at the table and talk. But there came a time when they said there is no other option open to us. The liberation movements had been banned. People were driven into exile. Mr. Mandela and his colleagues were in prison 27 years. Within that context, they began to fight back and said, we will pick up arms. And that happened in 1960. You can interpret this in terms of your own history, can't you? 1776 and all the rest of it. There comes a time. Now, when one listened to church theology, one would have sworn to God that these people expounding it were all pacifists. But they were happy to take up arms against the communists. They were happy to go to the First World War and the Second World War. But they were not prepared to support a movement in South Africa that said, listen, we've gone so far and we can go no other, we've got to resort to arms. Church theology, nice theology, comforting theology. And then thirdly, there was a prophetic theology, or what we called a Kairos theology. And Kairos is merely, this is an appointed time where we've got to say something. And we said that when we analyze the situation in South Africa, we realize this country is in serious trouble. We said we've got to identify with the poor. We've got to identify with the oppressed. And we said to those people who were poor and oppressed, we believe that the gospel is a gospel of hope. It's a gospel of liberation. It's a gospel that's calling us to come together, black and white, rich and poor, all of us to come together to work for God's kingdom. So we said three theologies: state theology, church theology, prophetic, or Kairos theology. Can I tell you something? The state came down upon us like a ton of bricks. One of my happier times when I was in prison was when I was informed by my interrogators one night that the next day they would be bringing in a theologian to talk to me. So they brought in this young man, and we had a great theological conversation. He asked me what I thought about liberation theology. So I said, whose liberation theology? He eventually told me to stop being cheeky. I said, I'm not being cheeky. You've come to have a conversation with me. So whose theology are you talking about? Gutierrez or Benino or Sabrino? Who are you talking about? Let's have a conversation. They wanted to know why I was participating in the Kairos document. This is what it did to the state. But you know where our major fight was? Can I tell you? The church. The church. Because the church said, now wait a bit, you're pushing this thing too far. You're going to divide the congregation. All sorts of terrible things could happen. You mustn't do it. I remember going to the Methodist Synod, because I was a Methodist, and proposed that the church, the Methodist Church, adopt the Kairos document. Well, I mean, one would have thought that the world was coming to an end. I had certain very prominent bishops, who I shall not name in this polite company, who stood up on the floor and fought it tooth and nail. But in the end, we won the debate, and we adopted the Kairos document. Why? Because the majority of that particular synod happened to be black people. That's what saved the day. And we said the Kairos document is speaking on behalf of oppressed people who in South Africa happen to be largely black. But I can tell you many anecdotes and many stories about that all. But Kairos document was a turning point in the South African struggle, where some Christians in the church stood up and said to the old apartheid regime, no more. We actually called, which caused almost more trouble than the Kairos document, we called for a national day of prayer when we would pray for the downfall of the government. Well, that's the day the heavens nearly did collapse. I remember an occasion when we were holding a service, a church service, in Cape Town, in District 6, where I happened to be the minister. And we met on a Wednesday night. To do what? To pray for those people who were in prison. Because it was illegal to disclose in the media the names of people who had been detained under the Suppression of Communism Act. Can you believe it? I was one of those, by the way. And the government tried to close down, the police tried to close down that service. They put caskets, tanks, against the doors of the church and wouldn't allow anybody to come in. So some of our parishioners were locked inside. Others couldn't get in from the outside. That's the kind of turmoil that the Kairos document was causing in that place. That was 85. Mr. Mandela came out of jail in 1990. So God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. And sometimes it doesn't take as long as we all thought. But let me move on. Apartheid was a particular kind of ideology, political ideology, which demanded a particular kind of theological response. Then there's Palestine. And you've heard about Palestine. And Jane gave us such a lovely overview of the whole situation. I'm not going to go there. But the Palestinians created their own Kairos document, didn't they? Where they too, in their own way, said, we're going no further. 2009. They spelt it out theologically. And I remember so clearly at the time, there was a certain Rabbi Asherman, who was part of the Rabbis for Human Rights group. And he made that stirring speech where he said, I see Jerusalem burning like a prophet of old. The Palestinians came together and they resisted. And there were the intifadas, and there was the Kairos document. You know, and when I look at the parallels between South Africa and Israel, I can go on and on and on, and no analogies are ever precise. We can all pick holes in them. But the similarities are amazing. Apartheid is introduced in South Africa in 1948. The State of Israel is declared in 1948. We can talk about similar histories, a land without a people and a people without a land. You know what happened in South Africa? White people just arrived, and there was this barren land, and so they occupied it, and they possessed it. Amazing what the mind can tell you. That which is in front of your noses, you cannot see. I can tell you about land being occupied and people driven into the homelands, what we call Bantustans, and I look at the presentation that we had earlier today, and I just want to say snap. And when I look at the so-called West Bank, I see the Paputetswana homeland in South Africa. Little pockets of land here, there, and everywhere. And I hear about a two-state solution. Excuse me. No two-state solution in its present formation can ever be viable in that situation. So the Palestinians, through their Kairos document, began to resist. 2009. One of the more interesting things, of course, is that 2 years later, on the second anniversary of the Palestinian Kairos document, what happens? The Americans come up with a Kairos document. And that was a major development. It was a call for action. It was a significant criticism of American foreign policy in propping up and aiding Israel. And as I try to say this morning from a higher elevation, so let me say it from down here, I think there's a relatively simple solution, and that is if America cut off its funding to Israel. That'll do it. You don't have to be Einstein. You don't have to be the prophet Jeremiah or Isaiah or anyone else. It's just a little bit of common sense. I think Bill Clinton would have said, it's arithmetic, damn it. That would sober them up, because it's what sobered us up. It would sober us up. It's what sobered us up. And that, in essence, is what this American Kairos document is asking for. Now, you know, the trouble with professors is they spend their time answering questions that nobody else is asking. So let me try and pull this together, and you can ask the questions you want to. What then is Kairos theology? Whether in South Africa, or in Palestine, or in the United States of America, I want to suggest there are three dimensions. There's a triad. There are three dimensions to Kairos theology. The first dimension of Kairos theology involves a political analysis of the situation. In our Kairos document, we spoke of reading the signs of the times. It's called political analysis. Political analysis. When we looked at South Africa, and we said, now let's put all the propaganda aside from both sides and all the political spin and all the rest of it. Let's be honest now. What's it all about? It has to do with race, and it has to do with greed, and it has to do with a certain kind of exploitative capitalism. That's what was propping the South African regime up. And that's what we took on directly, head on. Eyeball to eyeball. I remember some quite prominent American theologians coming to visit us in Cape Town, and they said, listen, we've been around, we've been into your churches, we've been to these services where you pray for the release of prisoners and what have you. What is this? Is this a political meeting? Or is it a religious meeting? I said, well, you tell me. They said, well, it's very difficult for us to say. I said, I want to tell you something, it's both. It's both. Because we're not prepared to separate religion from politics. The first thing that you do in a Kairos situation is to analyze the situation, say, stop telling one another stories, what is going on here? Because it's only on that basis that you can then make a decision as to which side you're going to be on, which side I'm going to be on. The second thing about a Kairos theology is this, that it's an affirmation of the message of Jesus. So the Kairos document, yes, it's political analysis, but secondly, a Kairos document has to do with the integrity of the gospel. The integrity of the gospel. But there are three very clear phases in the early history of the Christian church. The first is that message proclaimed by Jesus, which was expounded by the church through until AD 70. What happened in AD 70? The Romans, if you like to use modern language, bombed the temple. They went in there and they obliterated the temple. They had now had enough. They were going to close down this Jewish nationalist uprising. It was over. And so that which was written before AD 70 was a fairly dynamic message. It was that dangerous message that that Metz is proclaiming. After AD 70, what happens? The Christians begin to calm down. They are now in trouble. They're going to be liquidated. They're going to be got rid of unless they adjust their message a little bit and begin to distance themselves from these terrible Jews, begin to distance themselves from these nationalists, these Jewish nationalists, and they begin to proclaim a far milder gospel. And that's where dear old St. Paul comes into it all and says, obey your masters. A far more moderate kind of gospel. It's beginning to be proclaimed in a Gentile rather than in a Jewish world. The gospel is changing from the message of Jesus to a different kind of message. And then, what's the next important date? 310. What happens in AD 310? Constantine is converted. And so the Christians very happily leave the catacombs and they join the State Department. And the message that we then hear proclaimed is not only a milder, softer form such as St. Paul tried to introduce rather than this rabble-rouser called Jesus. It's not only that milder, more palatable kind of gospel. This is state theology. We now have state theology. The Roman Empire is declared Christian. And what does the church do? It gets right in line. Gets right in line. And it becomes, I'm sorry to say, an oppressive ideology. And it's that ideology that we continue to struggle with still today in the Christian churches. That's why the bishops in my church didn't want to sign the Kairos document. Because we were telling them you cannot be in bed with the state. You've got to be in bed with the poor and the oppressed. That's where you belong. Because that was the message of Jesus. Now somebody's been waving a figure 2 at me. And so let me close with the words of the prophet Isaiah and the words of Jesus. That dangerous memory. Because Jesus decides to quote Isaiah. And he says, and I quote, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim the release of captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed people go free, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." That is Kairos theology. It's a dangerous theology, and it's a reminder to all of us to make a decision where we're going to stand. Thank you.